Silverbow woke up with the first rays of sun breaking through the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. A small town in the heart of Montana, nestled in a valley between mountains, where the main street stretched for only 6 blocks and the population barely reached 7,500 people. Once upon a time, copper mines flourished here. But now the town lived off a sawmill, a little tourism, and federal subsidies. Here, everyone knew their neighbors not only by name, but also knew their family history going back 3 generations. Thomas Collins stood at the window of the sheriff's office, sipping coffee from his favorite mug with the inscription, "World's Greatest Dad," a gift from his son on Father's Day last year. Outside the window, snow-covered slopes were visible. Even at the end of April, the snow was in no hurry to leave the mountaintops. At 45, he looked younger, although the gray hair at his temples betrayed his years of service in the harsh mountain climate. He had worn the sheriff's badge for 20 years, and the townspeople trusted him more than the mayor or anyone else in the county. "Nervous, groom?" Deputy Sheriff Dan Harris's voice sounded slightly mocking. Dan was 7 years older than Thomas, his face weathered by the mountain winds and his hands scarred from working on a ranch in his youth before joining the police force. They had worked side by side for 15 years, patrolling the mountain roads and settling disputes between locals and visiting tourists. "One more week," Thomas turned to his friend, his gaze falling on the mountains outside the window. "Sometimes it seems like time flies too fast, and sometimes it seems like these 3 years have lasted forever. After everything you've been through with Linda, you deserve happiness, Tom. Hell, we've all seen it." At the mention of his ex-wife's name, Thomas's face darkened slightly. His divorce 3 years ago had rocked Silverbow. The sheriff's divorce was the talk of every house in town. Linda fought for every dollar, every piece of furniture, and especially hard for their son, Jake. The court hearings at the courthouse on Main Street became a real spectacle for the locals. At that time, in the only hospital in the county, located 3 blocks from the sheriff's office, Susan Wright was checking her morning appointments. At 38, she exuded the quiet confidence that makes good nurses indispensable in small mountain towns, where the nearest major medical center is a 2-hour drive away on winding mountain roads. 2 years ago, she had moved to Silverbow from Billings, looking for a quiet place after her own painful divorce. "How's the wedding planning going, dear?" asked her colleague Betty, a nurse who had worked at the hospital for 30 years and remembered when the mines were still operating in town. Betty knew every family in the county, including their medical secrets. "Almost everything is ready, just a few things left." Susan fell silent, thinking about her upcoming meeting with Jake. Her 16-year-old stepson had never fully accepted her, and in a small town, that was especially noticeable. On the other side of town, in a small house on Maple Street, in the shadow of an abandoned mine tower, Linda Collins was stocking shelves at Mountain Fresh, the local supermarket. It was the only large store in town, serving not only Silverbow, but also the surrounding ranches. At 43, she was still an attractive woman, but the harsh Montana winters and the last few years of struggle had left their mark. Divorce had taken away not only her husband, but also her social status as the sheriff's wife, which meant a lot in a small mountain town. "Mom, I have practice at 7, Jake said as he stopped by the store on his way home from school. Tall for a 16-year-old, he had inherited his father's height and his mother's stubbornness. There was only one high school in Silverbow, and everyone knew that Jake Collins was one of the best players on the basketball team. "Okay, honey, dinner will be ready at 8. Linda watched her son leave, her heart sinking. Soon everything would change. After his father's wedding, Jake would probably spend even more time with his new family in their big house on the hill. That evening, Thomas drove home to his 2-story house on the hillside, one of the most prestigious locations in Silverbow, with a view of the entire valley. The house had been built in the 1920s by the owner of a local mine and was considered one of the most beautiful in town. It seemed too big for one person, but soon Susan would be living there, and maybe Jake too, if the court reconsidered the custody issue. "Dad?" Jake sat on the porch steps, still in his gym clothes after practice, his breath steaming in the cool mountain air. "Hi, son. How's school? How was practice?" "Fine." The coach says I have a chance to get a scholarship to the university in Missoula. Jake paused, looking at the mountains. Dad, did you have to get married so soon? Thomas sat down next to his son on the steps, feeling the familiar chill of the mountain evening. Jake, I know this is hard, but Susan is a good person. She's not trying to replace your mom. Mom says you left her for a younger woman. She says she doesn't even have enough money to send me to college now. Your mother. Thomas chose his words carefully. People say things when they're hurting. Our marriage was over long before I met Susan. And as for college, we'll work something out. Jake nodded, but Thomas could see that his son was still struggling with conflicting emotions. That same Saturday, Susan stopped by Mountain Fresh to pick up some groceries for dinner practice. Linda was standing at the register, an awkward encounter that both women had been trying to avoid for the past few months. In Silver Bow, it was nearly impossible to avoid anyone. Good afternoon, Linda. Susan. Linda scanned the items mechanically. Getting ready for the big day? The whole town is talking about it. Yes, next week. Susan felt tense but tried to be friendly. Linda, I want you to know that I will never try to replace you in Jake's life. Linda stopped, holding a package of rice in her hands. Her gaze hardened. You think you know my son? You think you know my ex-husband? Her voice remained even, but her eyes flashed. You've only lived here for 2 years, dear. I grew up here. I know every family, every secret in these mountains. I don't want any conflicts, Linda. Conflicts? Linda laughed briefly. There's no conflict yet. But families in small mountain towns are complicated, especially when children are involved. Memories are long here, and forgiveness comes slowly. Susan picked up her bags and left the store with an uneasy feeling, the cold mountain air hitting her face. On Sunday evening, Thomas, Susan, and Dan met at the local cafe, the Silver Spoon, to discuss the final details of the wedding. The location was not chosen at random. It was where the town's elite gathered, a small but influential group. And Thomas wanted everyone to see that he was happy and ready for a new life. All the guests have confirmed, Dan said, leafing through the list. The mayor, the city council, the owner of the sawmill, half the police department from the neighboring county. It's going to be a real celebration for Silver Bow. We haven't had anything like this in a long time. What about Jake? Susan asked. He'll be there, Thomas assured her. I talked to him. He agreed to be the best man. And Linda? An awkward silence fell. Outside the cafe, the first streetlights came on in the twilight. We didn't send her an invitation, Thomas finally said. I thought it would be better for everyone. Dan frowned, putting down his fork. Tom, maybe you should have. In a small town like this, it might seem disrespectful. People will talk. Linda made her own choice. She could have behaved civilly for the last 3 years. But even as he said the words, Thomas felt uneasy. He had known Linda for 20 years, since they were teenagers in this same small town, and he knew she wasn't the type to swallow her pride. In the mountains of Montana, people didn't forget betrayals. Monday started with trouble. At 7 in the morning, the phone rang at Thomas's house. Old Bill McPherson, the owner of a ranch 20 miles from town, reported a cattle theft. It was the 3rd case in a month, and Thomas began to suspect that these were not random thefts, but the work of an organized group. Dan, get ready. We're going to McPherson's, Thomas said as he pulled on his boots, when the phone rang again. This time it was Susan. Tom, I'm sorry to call so early. We're having heating problems at the hospital, and we need to sort out the repairs before the wedding. I won't be able to meet you for lunch. Thomas felt irritated. It seemed as if everything was conspiring against their wedding. At the McPherson Ranch, they found tracks leading to a mountain road, the same one that ran past the old abandoned mines. Dan crouched down, studying the hoof prints. Professional work, Tom. They knew what they were doing, and they knew the area. Someone local? Or someone who knows this area well? Dan stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. Tom, I need to tell you something. About Linda. Thomas tensed. What exactly? She was at the Copper Mine bar last night. She was drinking heavily and saying things. About you, about the wedding. What kind of things? Dan shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. She said you took everything from her. Her house, her son, her status. That Susan is just another attempt to show the town that you can get any woman you want. Thomas clenched his fists. She was drunk. Tom, people were listening to her, and some people are starting to ask questions. What kind of questions? About why the divorce was so ugly, about what really happened between you two. Thomas turned away, staring at the mountains. Dan didn't know the whole truth. No one in town did. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Susan was trying to fix the heating, but her mind was elsewhere. The night before, she had received a strange phone call, a woman's voice who identified herself as a family friend and warned her that she didn't know what she was getting herself into. "Susan, are you all right?" Betty asked, noticing her distraction. "Betty, did you know Linda Collins before she got married?" Betty paused, holding the medical chart in her hands. "I did. Linda Harris back then. Nice girl from a decent family. Her father was a miner until the mines closed." "Harris?" Susan was surprised. "Like Dan? Dan is her cousin. Didn't Tom tell you?" Susan felt the world around her sway. Dan was related to Linda, and Thomas had never mentioned it. "Betty, what happened during their divorce? Why was it so painful?" Betty looked around to make sure no one was nearby. "Darling, I don't like to gossip, but there was talk of money. That Tom was taking bribes from ranch owners who were illegally using public land to graze their cattle. Linda threatened to tell everyone." Susan felt her breath catch. Bribes? Rumors, of course. But in a small town, rumors can ruin a career and a reputation. Betty lowered her voice. And then suddenly Linda agreed to divorce terms that weren't good for her at all. People were asking questions. At the same time, at Silverbow High School, Jake Collins sat at the back of his history class, but he wasn't listening to the teacher. His mind was preoccupied with the conversations he had heard at home. His mother cried at night, thinking he was asleep. She talked on the phone with someone about justice and the truth coming out. After school, instead of going home, he went to his father's office at the sheriff's station. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Thomas looked up from his papers. "Of course, son. What's wrong?" "Mom's saying strange things. About money." Thomas turned pale. "Jake, your mother is going through a difficult time. Divorce is always painful. But she says she has proof. Dad, is it true?" Thomas stood up from the table and walked over to his son. "Jake, I've never done anything that would disgrace you. I swear." But Jake saw something in his father's eyes, the fear he was trying to hide. That evening, Linda sat in her small kitchen sorting through bills. Electricity, gas, car payments, it all had to be paid, and her cashier's salary barely covered the basics. She opened a drawer in her desk and took out an envelope she had kept there for the past 3 years. Inside were photographs of Thomas meeting with Jack Morrison, the owner of the largest ranch in the county. In one photo, Thomas was accepting an envelope. In another, they were shaking hands next to Thomas's patrol car. Linda had taken these photos by accident 3 years ago when she was driving along a mountain road and saw her husband's patrol car in an unexpected place. She decided to find out what was going on and had been gathering evidence ever since. Jack Morrison was illegally grazing cattle on public land, and Thomas was turning a blind eye in exchange for regular payments. When Linda discovered this, she tried to talk to her husband, but he dismissed her, saying she didn't understand how the real world worked. The divorce began because of this. Linda threatened to go to the federal prosecutor's office, but then Thomas found a way to stop her. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Linda, it's Dan." "Hi, cousin." Linda's voice was cold. "Linda, we need to talk about what you said at the bar yesterday." "What did I say?" "You know what? People are starting to ask questions and it could hurt all of us." "All of us? Or just Thomas?" Dan paused. "Linda, I know you're angry, but think about Jake. Think about what will happen if what, Dan? If the truth comes out? If you ruin your son's life for revenge?" Linda hung up, her hands shaking. Dan was right about Jake, but how long could she keep quiet while watching her ex-husband build a new life based on a lie? The next day, Susan decided to talk to Thomas about what she had learned from Betty. They met at the Silver Spoon Cafe after her shift. "Tom, why didn't you tell me that Dan is Linda's cousin?" Thomas froze with his coffee cup at his lips. "I didn't think it was important." Not important? Tom, we're getting married in 5 days, and I'm finding out things like this from strangers. Susan, their relationship doesn't affect our lives. What about the rumors of bribery? Doesn't that matter either? Thomas's face turned to stone. Who told you that? Tom, is it true? There was a long pause. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. Late spring snow, which could fall in the mountains even in May. Linda started the rumors. During the divorce, she was willing to do anything to get more money. But you didn't answer my question. Thomas looked her in the eyes. Susan, I've been a sheriff for 20 years. In that time, I've made thousands of decisions. Some people think some decisions are right, others think others are right. But I've never done anything that was against the law. It wasn't a no, and Susan knew it. On Thursday evening, 3 days before the wedding, something happened that changed everything. Jake didn't come home after practice. Linda called all his friends, but no one knew where he was. At 10 o'clock, she called Thomas. Jake's missing. What do you mean, missing? He didn't come home after practice. He's nowhere to be found. Thomas immediately mobilized everyone available. Dan, 2 other deputies, and volunteers from the community all began searching. At midnight, they found Jake in an old cemetery outside of town, sitting on the grave of his grandfather, Linda's father. The boy was crying. Jake, what are you doing here? Thomas crouched down next to his son. I was thinking about Grandpa, about what he would say about all this. About what, son? About what's going on between you and Mom. About the secrets everyone's keeping. Jake looked at his father. Dad, Mom showed me the photos. Thomas's heart stopped. What pictures? Where you get the money from Uncle Jack Morrison. Mom says you took bribes. Is that true? In the moonlight, among the old gravestones, Thomas realized he could no longer lie to his son. Jake, it's complicated. Yes or no, Dad? A long pause. Somewhere in the mountains, a coyote howled. Yes, but not the way your mom thinks. Jake began to sob. So you really are a bad man? No, son. Sometimes good people do the wrong thing for the right reasons. But Jake wasn't listening anymore. He got up and ran to the road where the police car was waiting for them. On the way home, Thomas realized that his time was running out. Linda would never forgive him for letting their son find out the truth this way. And now she would be even more dangerous. On Friday morning, 2 days before the wedding, Linda arrived at the Silver Spoon Cafe where Thomas and Susan were having breakfast. The whole cafe fell silent. Everyone could feel the tension. Tom, we need to talk. Alone. Linda, now is not the time. Now is the time. She looked at Susan. Unless you want your fiancé to find out right here. Susan stood up. I'll go. No. Thomas took her by the arm. What do you want, Linda? Linda sat down at their table. I want you to call off the wedding. What? You heard me. Call off the wedding, or on Monday morning. The photos and all the documents will be with the federal prosecutor. Susan looked at Thomas. What photos? Linda smiled coldly. The ones of your fiancé taking bribes? For years. The entire cafe listened to every word. By the end of the day, the whole of Silver Bow would know about this conversation. Linda, Thomas began, you have until tomorrow to make a decision, Tom. Either the wedding is off, or you go to jail. She stood up and headed for the exit, but turned around at the door. Oh, and one more thing. Jake is moving in with me permanently. The court will be happy to review custody when they find out who his real father is. After she left, the cafe was deathly quiet. Saturday, the wedding day, began with a thick fog enveloping the Silver Bow Valley. The mountains disappeared in a white veil, and it seemed as if the whole world had shrunk to the size of a small town. In the house on the hill, Thomas Collins stood at the bedroom window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. He hadn't slept all night. Yesterday, after the scene in the cafe, Susan had left, saying she needed time to think. Thomas had called her 7 times, but she hadn't answered. At 4:30 in the morning, he received a short message. I'll be at church at 2 o'clock. Let's talk there. The phone rang. It was Dan. Tom, we need to meet, right now. Dan, today is my wedding day. That's exactly why we need to talk. Half an hour later, they met at the sheriff's office. Dan looked like he hadn't slept either. Tom, I had a long talk with Linda last night. And? She's not bluffing. She has photos of your meetings with Jack Morrison, copies of bank transfers, even recordings of conversations. Thomas sat down in a chair. How much does she know? Everything, Tom. She knows about the illegal grazing on public land, about how you turned a blind eye to violations in exchange for money. She even knows about that case 5 years ago when you lost the evidence against Morrison. Damn it! Thomas covered his face with his hands. Dan, it didn't start out as bribery. Morrison helped me when Jake was sick and insurance wouldn't cover the surgery. $20,000. I was going to pay him back, but then you realized he wanted something in return. I thought I was doing what was right for my family. Dan shook his head. Tom, I've been your friend for 15 years. I've seen how you help people, how you serve this town. But what you did with Morrison, I know. Thomas stood up and began pacing the office. Dan, what should I do? If Linda goes to the prosecutor's office, I'll go to jail. And if I call off the wedding, you'll lose Susan. And look like a man who gave in to blackmail by his ex-wife. Dan was silent for a long time. Tom, there's another option. What is it? You can go to the prosecutor's office yourself, confess everything, cooperate with the investigation. If you help them catch Morrison, you might get a minimal sentence. Thomas stopped. And get married in a prison uniform? Tom, I'm serious. Linda wants to destroy you. If you don't take the initiative, she'll do it for you. At that moment, in a small house on Maple Street, Linda Collins sat at the kitchen table sorting through documents. The envelope with the photos lay in front of her like a weapon ready to be used. Jake was asleep in his room. He'd come home late last night and immediately locked himself in, not wanting to talk. The phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Linda Collins? Yes. This is Susan Wright. We need to talk. Linda was surprised. About what? About Thomas? About the photos? About what's happening today? Do you want to meet? Yes. In the park by the old mine. In an hour. After Susan hung up, Linda stared at the phone for a long time. What was her bride up to? Did she want to talk her out of ruining the wedding? Or did she have something else in mind? The park by the abandoned mine was on the outskirts of town, where a mining community had once thrived. Now, all that remained were rusty structures and a memorial plaque. Linda arrived first and waited, sitting on an old bench. Susan appeared 10 minutes later. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was no hint of a bride getting ready for her wedding. Thanks for coming, Susan said, sitting down next to her. I thought you'd be getting ready for the ceremony. What ceremony? Susan smiled bitterly. Linda, I want to know the truth. The whole truth. About what? About what happened between you and Thomas. About the bribes. About why the divorce was so ugly. Linda studied the young woman's face. Are you sure you want to know? Yes. Linda sighed. All right, it started 5 years ago. Jake was diagnosed with a heart condition. He needed surgery, expensive surgery. Our insurance only covered part of the cost. And Thomas turned to Morrison? Jack Morrison owns half the land in the county. He's rich and influential. He offered to help with the money, but in return he wanted Tom to turn a blind eye to his illegal activities. Susan nodded, and Thomas agreed. At first he said it was temporary, that he'd pay back the money and get out of it. But Morrison isn't the kind of man who lets people off the hook. Every time Tom tried to back out, Jack reminded him of his debt. How did you find out? Linda laughed sadly. I was his wife for 20 years. I knew when he was lying. I saw how he changed, how he suffered. But when I tried to talk to him, he told me to stay out of his business. And then you started gathering evidence? I wanted to help him. I thought if I had proof, we could go to the police together and find a way out. But he didn't want to. Linda shook her head. He was furious. He said I didn't understand how the world worked, that sometimes you have to make compromises for the sake of your family. And then the divorce started? Tom filed for divorce to protect me. He said that if we divorced, Morrison wouldn't be able to use me against him, but I knew he just wanted me to keep quiet. Susan took a long time to process what she had heard. Linda, why did you keep quiet for 3 years? Why did you decide to act now? Linda's eyes filled with tears. Because I thought he would change, that after the divorce, he would end it and start a new life. But yesterday, Jake came home and told me that his father is still seeing Morrison. How does Jake know that? He saw them together last week, near the old road in the mountains. Susan closed her eyes. So it's still going on. Susan, I don't want to ruin your life, but I can't let him marry you based on a lie. What about Jake? Are you willing to destroy your son's relationship with his father? Linda was silent for a long time. Jake already knows the truth. Now he has to decide what's more important to him, the image of the perfect father or real justice. They sat in silence, staring at the rusty structures of the old mine. Somewhere in the mountains, a bird cried out, "Linda, what do you want? Really?" "I want Tom to confess everything, publicly. I want him to stop hiding behind his badge and take responsibility for his actions." "And if he doesn't?" "Then tomorrow morning, all the documents will be with the federal prosecutor." Susan stood up. "I have to go." "Are you still going to marry him?" Susan paused. "I don't know." At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Silverbow turned into a theater. The small Protestant church on Main Street was decorated with white ribbons and flowers. Guests began to arrive. The mayor, members of the city council, Thomas's colleagues from neighboring counties. Everyone was dressed up and in a festive mood, but there was tension in the air. Jake stood at the altar in his groomsman's suit, but his face was grim. He avoided looking at his father and kept glancing at the front door. Dan approached Thomas. "Tom, Susan isn't here yet." "She'll be here." "What if she doesn't show up?" Thomas didn't answer. He looked at the assembled guests and realized that many of them knew about yesterday's scene at the cafe. The whispering died down as he approached and resumed when he walked away. At 1:30, Susan appeared. She was wearing a simple white dress, no veil, and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. Beautiful, but sad. She walked slowly down the aisle, and Thomas saw determination in her eyes. "Susan," he whispered when she stood next to him, "we can postpone this. Go somewhere, talk." "No, Tom. If we're going to do this, we have to do it now." The pastor began the ceremony. The words about love, fidelity, and honesty sounded particularly poignant in the circumstances. Thomas felt his palms sweating. When the pastor reached the words, "If anyone objects to this marriage," a tense silence fell over the church. Everyone turned toward the front door, waiting for Linda to appear, but Linda was not there. "Let's continue," said the pastor. At that moment, the church door swung open with a loud creak, but it wasn't Linda. Jack Morrison entered the church, a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive suit. He was followed by two men in dark suits, clearly not locals. The entire church fell silent. "I apologize for being late," Morrison said loudly, "but I couldn't miss such an important event." Thomas turned pale. What was Morrison doing here? He never attended public events in town. Morrison walked to the pews and sat down in the front row, directly across from the altar. His companions remained standing against the wall. "Continue," he said to the pastor with a smile. The pastor hesitantly continued the ceremony. But the atmosphere in the church had changed. Everyone sensed that something was wrong. When it came time to exchange rings, Thomas noticed that Susan's hands were shaking. She looked at him with a question in her eyes, and he knew she was waiting for a sign from him, to continue or to stop. "Thomas Collins," said the pastor, "do you swear to love Susan in joy and in sorrow, in wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Thomas opened his mouth to say, "I do," but the words wouldn't come out. At that moment, the church door opened again. Linda Collins stood in the doorway in a black dress, holding a large envelope in her hands. Her face was pale but determined. "I'm sorry," she said loudly, addressing the entire church, "but I can't let this go on." She began to walk down the aisle toward the altar. Each step sounded like a hammer blow. "Linda, don't!" Jake whispered. But his mother didn't listen. She stopped in front of the altar and turned to face the congregation. "This man," she said, pointing at Thomas, "is not worthy of wearing a sheriff's badge, and he is certainly not worthy of marrying a good woman." The church erupted in whispers. "Linda, stop," Thomas said. "No," she shouted. I've kept quiet for 3 years. For 3 years, I let you play the role of an honest sheriff while you took bribes and covered up for criminals." She held up the envelope. "I have proof. Photographs, documents, records. It's all here." Morrison rose from his seat. "Linda, dear, you're upset. Maybe we should—" "Shut up, Jack," she shouted. "You're part of this too." One of Morrison's companions took a step forward, but he stopped him with a gesture. Susan took the wedding ring off her finger and placed it on the altar. "Tom," she said quietly, but everyone in the church heard her. "I can't." She turned and quickly walked toward the exit. The guests parted before her. "Susan, wait!" Thomas shouted, but she didn't stop. Linda was still standing at the altar, holding the envelope like a banner. "Tomorrow morning," she said, turning to her husband, "all of this will be with the federal prosecutor. Your game is over, Tom." Jake ripped the boutonniere off his lapel and threw it on the floor. "I'm leaving," he said, and headed for the exit. "Jake!" Thomas shouted, but his son didn't turn around. The church quickly emptied. The guests hurried to leave, not wanting to witness the family drama. Morrison and his men also disappeared. Only Thomas, Linda, and Dan remained. "Linda," Dan said, approaching his cousin, "do you realize what you've done?" "I did what I should have done 3 years ago." Thomas took off his tie and threw it on the floor next to his son's boutonniere. "You won, Linda. You destroyed everything. I told the truth. You destroyed your son's life, my life, Susan's life." Linda faltered for the first time. "Jake will understand. Someday he'll understand that I did it for justice." "For justice?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You did it out of revenge." "Maybe, but that doesn't make it any less true." Dan looked at them both, his best friend and his cousin, destroying each other. "What now?" he asked. Linda clutched the envelope to her chest. "Now, there will be justice." But none of them knew what price they would all have to pay for it. After the church emptied, only Thomas, Linda, and Dan remained in the sacred silence. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating scattered rose petals and discarded wedding programs. "Linda, let's talk like adults," Dan said, approaching his cousin. "You got what you wanted. The wedding is off. Tom's reputation is ruined. What more do you want?" "I want him to take responsibility," Linda replied, clutching the envelope containing the evidence. Thomas sat in the front pew, staring at the floor. "Linda, if you go to the district attorney's office, it won't just be me who suffers. Jake will suffer too. Do you want your son to be the son of a corrupt sheriff for the rest of his life? Better that than being the son of a liar." "Mom's right." All three turned around. Jake was standing in the doorway of the church. He had returned, but now his face was full of determination. "Jake," Thomas began, standing up. "No, Dad. I've been thinking about this the whole way here. Mom's right. You've been lying to me my whole life. Son, I did it to protect you." "Protect me from what? From the truth?" Jake stepped closer. "You know what the worst part is? It's not that you took bribes. It's that you made Mom keep quiet. You destroyed our family to hide your sins." Thomas felt something break inside him. "Jake, Dad, I don't want to see you anymore." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Suddenly, the church door swung open again. Jack Morrison entered alone, without his companions. "What a touching family scene," he said with a smirk. "But I'm afraid we need to talk." "Get out of here, Jack," Thomas said. "Oh no, Sheriff. It's too late for me to leave now." Morrison stepped closer. "You see, I have a problem. Your charming ex-wife wants to hand over some documents to federal agents. Documents that could get me into serious trouble." Linda instinctively clutched the envelope to her chest. "That evidence will end up in the prosecutor's office, no matter what you do." "I'm afraid not, dear." Morrison pulled a gun from his jacket, small but deadly. "Jack, what are you doing?" Dan exclaimed. "What I should have done 3 years ago. I'm taking care of it." Jake grabbed his mother's arm. "Mom, what's going on?" "Hush, son," Linda whispered. Thomas slowly raised his hands. "Jack, think about what you're doing. This is a church. There are children here." "That's exactly why I didn't want it to come to this," Morrison said. "But you, Tom, couldn't keep your family under control." "What do you want?" Dan asked. I want those documents, and I want everyone to forget what they know. Linda shook her head. Never. Linda, don't be stupid. I have money, a lot of money. I can solve your financial problems. Jake can go to any college he wants. With what? By keeping quiet about your crimes? With common sense. Thomas took a step forward. Jack, put the gun down. Let's talk like men. Stay where you are, Sheriff. You've made enough mistakes. The tension in the church reached a breaking point. Dan slowly moved toward his gun. Linda held her son tightly, and Thomas looked for a way to disarm Morrison. You know what pisses me off the most? Morrison continued. It's not that you want to set me up. It's that you pretend to be better than me. Tom, you took my money for 5 years. You were my partner for 5 years. I was never your partner, Thomas hissed. Of course you were. Every time you turned a blind eye to my dealings, you became an accomplice. Dad, is that true? Jake asked, his eyes fixed on the gun. Thomas closed his eyes. Yes, son, it's true, Morrison laughed. See? Honesty is so easy. Now let's all be honest. Linda, give me the envelope. No, Linda, Dan said softly. Give him the documents. We'll find another way. What way, Dan? You're all in this together. You knew what was going on, too. Dan turned pale. Linda, you knew your best friend was taking bribes, and you said nothing. You knew he was destroying our family, and you did nothing. I tried to stop him. Not hard enough. Morrison lost his patience. Enough! Linda, one last time. Give me the documents, or what? You'll kill me? Right here in the church, in front of my son? If I have to... Jake broke free from his mother's grip. Leave her alone! The teenager lunged at Morrison, but he was ready. The gun swung toward the boy. Jake, no! Linda screamed. Thomas and Dan moved forward simultaneously. At that moment, a shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the church. The echoes reverberated off the walls and arches, creating a cacophony of noise. Morrison fell to the floor, the gun slipping from his hand and flying away. Blood oozed from his chest, staining the white marble floor. Everyone froze in shock. What happened? Jake whispered. No one answered. Everyone stared at the dying Morrison, trying to understand what had happened. Morrison tried to speak, but blood came out of his mouth. He looked at someone behind the crowd, his eyes full of surprise and fear. You, he croaked, and fell silent. Only then did they hear the sound of a gun falling. Everyone turned around. Susan Wright stood at the entrance to the church, holding a smoking gun in her hand. Her face was white as chalk. Her hands were shaking. Susan? Thomas whispered. The gun fell from her hands and hit the floor with a metallic clang. He was going to kill Jake, she whispered. Susan, what are you doing here? Dan asked. I forgot my purse. I came back for it and heard the screams. Linda ran to her son and hugged him. Jake, are you all right? The boy nodded, unable to speak. Thomas approached Susan. Where did you get the gun? It's Morrison's gun. He dropped it when he fell. Dan frowned. Susan, Morrison fell after the shot. How could he have dropped the gun before he was wounded? Susan fell silent, realizing she had gotten confused in her testimony. I don't remember exactly. It all happened so fast. Thomas looked at her intently. Susan, tell me the truth. What really happened? But before she could answer, people burst into the church. They were Morrison's associates, who had heard the gunshot. What's going on here? One of them shouted when he saw his boss's body. Call an ambulance and the police, Dan said, taking out his phone. But one of Morrison's men had already drawn his weapon. Who did this? He demanded. No one answered. I'm asking who killed Mr. Morrison. Susan opened her mouth to confess, but Thomas quickly stepped between her and the armed man. Put down your weapon. I'm the sheriff of this county. Not the sheriff anymore, the man said. Mr. Morrison told us about your relationship. The situation was quickly getting out of control. Morrison's men were armed and angry. There was a dead body in the church, and one of the people present was the killer. Dan managed to call for backup, but it would be several minutes before they arrived. Listen, he said to Morrison's men. There are children here. Let's settle this civilly. Civilly? Sneered one of them. You killed our boss. This is war. Linda held Jake closer to her. Thomas stood next to Susan. Dan kept his hand on his holster. The tension reached a breaking point again. Then sirens sounded outside. "Police!" someone shouted. Morrison's men looked at each other. One of them headed for the exit to check the situation. "The whole state police force is here," he reported. "Damn," cursed the second man. "We have to get out of here." "What about the boss?" "The boss is dead, but we can get revenge later." They quickly left the church through the back door, leaving everyone alone with the body and a lot of questions. A minute later, police officers from the neighboring county, led by Captain Jones, burst into the church. "What happened here?" he asked when he saw Morrison's body. Dan approached him. "Captain, this is a complicated situation. Jack Morrison threatened us with a gun. Someone shot him in self-defense." "Who exactly?" Everyone looked at Susan. She stood there trembling, unable to utter a word. "It was self-defense," Dan repeated. "Morrison threatened to kill the child." Captain Jones looked around. "Where's the weapon?" Dan pointed to the gun lying next to Susan. "That's Morrison's gun," he explained. "The shooter took it to protect us." "I see." The captain signaled his men to begin processing the crime scene. "I'll need to interview all the witnesses." Thomas put his arm around Susan's shoulders. "Everything will be all right," he whispered in her ear. But Susan continued to tremble. And there was something in her eyes that made Thomas worry. What had really happened in that church? And why was Susan so afraid to tell the truth? The Silver Bow police station had been turned into a wartime headquarters. Captain Jones from the neighboring county had brought a team of detectives from Helena with him, and the small building was buzzing with activity. Thomas sat in his own office, but now no longer as sheriff, but as a witness, and a possible suspect in the corruption scheme that had led to the murder. Detective Ramirez, an experienced investigator with 20 years on the force, studied the conflicting witness statements. Something about this case didn't add up from the start. "Miss Wright claims she took the gun from Morrison and shot him," he said to his partner, Detective Chen. "But all the other witnesses say Morrison was holding the gun until the moment the shot was fired." "Maybe she took a spare gun," Chen suggested. "Morrison only had one gun. We checked." In the interrogation room, Susan sat at a metal table, still in her blood-stained wedding dress. Detective Martinez, a middle-aged woman with a soft voice, had been trying to get a coherent story out of her for 3 hours. "Susan, help me understand. You say you went back to the church to get your purse?" "Yes." "But we didn't find the purse." Susan froze. "I may not have taken it. It all happened so fast." "Okay, you walked into the church and saw Morrison threatening people?" "Yes." He pointed the gun at Jake, at the child. "And what did you do?" "I couldn't let him hurt the boy." "Where did you get the gun?" It was the 5th time she had been asked that question, and each time her answer had been different. "I took his gun." "How?" "He was holding it." "He dropped it." "Before or after he fired?" Susan closed her eyes. "I don't remember exactly." Detective Martinez realized that the woman was either in deep shock or hiding the truth. In the next room, Dan Harris was giving his statement to Captain Jones. The deputy sheriff looked exhausted and more nervous than usual. "Mr. Harris, were you in the church from the beginning of the conflict?" "Yes. I was trying to de-escalate the situation." "Tell me what happened when Morrison showed up." Dan rubbed his face with his hands. "Jack was armed. He demanded Linda's documents and threatened all of us. And then, Jake, Tom's son, tried to protect his mother. He rushed toward Morrison. And Morrison pointed his gun at him. The boy was 16 years old, Captain. I couldn't just stand there and watch." Captain Jones looked up from his notes. "What exactly did you do, Mr. Harris?" A long pause. The mountain wind howled outside the window. "I fired." "With what?" "With my service weapon." The captain stopped recording. "Mr. Harris, are you saying that you killed Jack Morrison?" "Yes, I shot him in the chest. He fell and dropped his gun." "And Miss Wright?" Dan sighed heavily. "Susan appeared right after the shot. She saw me with the gun in my hands and realized what had happened." "And?" "She said she couldn't let me suffer for saving the child. She picked up Morrison's gun from the floor and claimed she had done it." "Why did you agree to that?" Dan looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains. "Captain, You know how this looks? A deputy sheriff kills a man who was about to expose his boss's corruption. Even if it was self-defense, my career would be over. And Susan isn't from around here. She doesn't have that kind of baggage. But she could still go to prison. We were hoping they'd accept self-defense. Morrison really did threaten to kill the child. The captain wrote down the last words and put down his pen. Dan Harris, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. The news of Dan's arrest spread through the station like wildfire. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Captain, that's impossible. Dan is my best friend. He would never… Mr. Collins, your friend just confessed to murder. Thomas demanded to see Dan in the holding cell. They sat on opposite sides of the bars, both looking broken. Dan, why did you do it? Tom, I saw Morrison pointing a gun at your son. What would you have done in my place? I don't know. You know, you would have done the same thing. Jake is alive because of that shot. Thomas grabbed the bars. Now what? You'll be charged with first-degree murder. Maybe, but my conscience is clear. Dan, did you know about my relationship with Morrison? About the bribes? Dan was silent for a long time. I suspected it, but there was no proof. I hoped you'd find a way out yourself. Why didn't you stop me? Tom, you're my best friend, and Linda is my cousin. I was caught between a rock and a hard place. Thomas realized that his actions had destroyed not only his family's life, but also that of his best friend. At that moment, in the house on Maple Street, Linda and Jake sat in the kitchen trying to make sense of what had happened. Her mother held her son's hand tightly. Mom, did Uncle Dan kill a man because of me? Uncle Dan saved your life, dear, but now he's in jail. Linda nodded. Sometimes good people have to do terrible things. What about the documents? The evidence against Dad? Linda looked at the envelope lying on the table. After everything that had happened, her thirst for revenge seemed less important. I don't know, Jake. Uncle Dan got hurt because of our family problems. Maybe it's time to stop. But Dad has to take responsibility, right? Yes, but not at the expense of other people's lives. Jake nodded. At 16, he understood the complexity of the adult world better than many adults. The next day, Linda went to see Susan at the hospital. The women met in an empty ward, away from prying eyes. Susan, thank you for trying to protect Dan. Linda, I couldn't let him get hurt for saving your son. But now you could get in trouble too, for giving false testimony. Susan shrugged. That's my problem. Linda sat down next to her. Susan, I need to tell you something. About the documents, the evidence against Tom. I'm listening. I was going to turn them over to the DA tomorrow morning. But after what happened to Dan, have you changed your mind? I don't know. Tom has to be held accountable. But Dan has already paid too high a price for our family problems. Susan took Linda's hand. Linda, what if we find a way to punish Tom but help Dan at the same time? What do you mean? Tom could go to the district attorney himself, confess everything, cooperate with the investigation, and in return, ask for leniency for Dan. Linda thought about it. Do you think he'll go for it? If he's really changed, then yes. That evening, Susan met with Thomas at the station. They sat in his former office, where he had been sheriff until recently. Tom, I have a proposal. I'm listening. Go to the district attorney's office yourself, confess everything and offer to cooperate. Maybe it will help Dan. Thomas was silent for a long time. Susan, if I do that, they'll put me in jail. Maybe. But Dan killed a man defending your son. Don't you owe him that? I do. Thomas stood up and walked over to the window. But what about us? What about our plans? Tom, I didn't fall in love with the sheriff or with a perfect man. I fell in love with someone who is capable of admitting his mistakes and making amends. Will you wait for me? If you make the right choice? Yes. The next morning, Thomas Collins appeared at the state prosecutor's office in Helena with his lawyer. Federal prosecutor McCartney, a gray-haired man with 30 years of experience, listened attentively to his confession. Mr. Collins, do you understand the seriousness of your confession? I do. I am prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation. In exchange for what? Leniency for Dan Harris. He killed Morrison while defending my son. It was self-defense. McCartney studied the documents Thomas had brought. All right, we'll consider your offer. An hour later, Linda arrived at the prosecutor's office with a complete package of her evidence. She was surprised to learn that Thomas had already confessed everything. Mrs. Collins, your ex-husband beat you to it. He came in himself? Yes, and he offered his full cooperation. Linda felt a mixture of relief and surprise. So Tom really had changed. What will happen to Dan Harris now? That will depend on the court, but your ex-husband's confession will help Mr. Harris's case. Dan Harris's trial took place 2 months later. The entire Collins family came to support him. Thomas testified on his friend's behalf, explaining that Dan had acted to protect an innocent child from an armed criminal. The jury returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter. Dan received a 3-year suspended sentence with probation. Thomas received 4 years in prison for corruption, but his cooperation with the investigation helped uncover a whole network of illegal operations involving state lands. A year after the tragedy in the church, life in Silverbow began to return to normal. Dan was appointed acting sheriff and earned the respect of the townspeople for his honesty. Susan continued to work at the hospital and visited Thomas every week in prison in Billings. They planned to get married after his release. Linda was promoted to department manager at the supermarket and was able to save money for Jake's education. Her son received a basketball scholarship to the University of Montana and planned to study criminal justice. One winter evening, when Silverbow was covered in snow, Linda, Jake, Dan, and Susan met at the Silver Spoon Cafe, the very place where they had once planned their wedding. You know, Dan said, stirring his coffee. Sometimes I think about that day in the church. What do you think about? Linda asked. About how sometimes you have to make terrible choices, but if that choice saves an innocent person's life, then it's the right choice. Jake nodded. Uncle Dan, I'll never forget what you did for me. Jake, I did what any decent man would have done. Susan looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains. Do you know what Tom wrote to me last week? What? Linda asked. He said that for the first time in many years he can sleep peacefully, because there are no more secrets, no more lies. Did prison change him? Dan asked. Not prison. The truth changed him. The truth set him free long before he'll be physically free. Linda nodded. You know, I'm not angry with Tom anymore. The anger was destroying me from the inside. Now I feel at peace. Mom, Jake said, can I visit Dad in prison? Of course, dear. He's your father and he loves you. They sat in the warm cafe, listening to the mountain wind howling outside. Each of them had paid a high price for the truth, but they all understood that it was a price worth paying. A memorial plaque was installed in the church where the tragedy occurred. It read, "The truth will set you free, but first, it will hurt." Silverbow remained a small town in the mountains of Montana where everyone knew each other. But now that knowledge was not based on gossip and rumors, but on the understanding that every person is capable of both mistakes and redemption. And in the mountains of Montana, as before, birds sang and snow fell on the peaks even on the warmest days. Silverbow continued to live its life, the slow, measured life of a small mountain town where everyone knows each other. But now that knowledge included not only family secrets and local gossip, but also the understanding that every person is capable of both mistakes and redemption, and that sometimes the hardest trials lead to the most important discoveries about oneself, about others, and about what really matters in life.